All right, we're going to be looking now at the book of Exodus. And before, there's a lot of background material. I think it's very helpful to know. I'm not going to spend as much time as I normally do on it. But your book already discussed a little bit about this, some background material as far as the children of Israel in the land of Egypt. I think it's always kind of helpful just to kind of know a few of the basics at least. Children of Israel weren't in slavery for 400 years. Okay? How many total years were they in Egypt? You remember? Yes? 400? Close. Acts chapter 7 uses the term 400 as a rounded figure, but the actual number of years is 430 years. And that's mentioned in several other places. But what I'm saying is it's important to understand this is not how long they were in slavery. They weren't throwing Israelite babies in the river for 430 years. Okay? So this is how long when Jacob moved to Egypt until the night of the Passover in Exodus chapter 14 is exactly 430 years. The Bible says so, to the day. So that's a hard, fast time that they were in Egypt. We believe that to be 1876 to 1446 BC. 1876 to 1446 BC. That's 430 years. All right, so how much of that were they in slavery? We don't know that for sure, but we can kind of guess a little bit. So how long did Joseph live after Jacob moved down to Egypt? Joseph was 110 when he died, so he was 39, I believe, when his dad moved down there. So how many is that? About 71 years. Okay, so that puts us at 360 more years. And then there's a new Pharaoh that came along. There was uprising in Egypt that brought in a new Pharaoh. So I believe that's the Hyksos kings, I think, if I remember right. But anyway, so it's about 360 years. Another Pharaoh comes on the scene, probably 50 years or so after that. That's about 300. Even then, the Bible doesn't necessarily say that immediately they were throwing the babies in the river. That probably was just for a little while, even though they were maybe oppressed as slaves for 200 years or so. Generally, most people believe that they were in slavery for about 250 years. 250 years. Okay, now, so it's important to understand, I think, the length of time that they were in Egypt. The Bible's very clear on the 430, and then about how long they were in slavery. In Exodus chapter 1, it talks about the details of that. These guys were just at Sight and Sound Theater, a couple of guys, but they didn't have the Moses show going. This summer, I was at the Moses show, and I got to watch that. It's very, just very interesting, very eye-opening to see the decision that his mom had to make and that Moses had to make. That they were going to follow the Lord, especially that Moses was going to follow the Lord. So, all right. Now, what was Egypt like? Before we dig into Exodus, what was Egypt like? What were the pharaohs like? Egyptian history. Anybody like Egyptian history? Okay, some of you. Egyptian history, to me, I don't know, and they were weird. The pharaohs. Number of the pharaohs, it was common for them to marry within their own family to keep the power in their own family. And so there's several of these. The mother of Moses, thank you. The mother of Moses married her daughter to, who would this be? Her grandson or something like that? Yes? At the age of 10, the daughter was 10. to make sure that they consolidate authority within their family. So if you marry outside the family, you start to lose the authority. Isn't that ridiculous? They're weird, like I said. And that was evidently very common, that they would marry within their own family. Often it would not be full-blood brothers and sisters, so don't think of it that close, even though it's still despicable. But it'd be half sister, half brother. Of course, the pharaohs usually had more than one wife, and so they would intermarry some of those half brothers and sisters. So after a while, the gene pool kind of breaks down a little bit. But all right, so now let me just mention this about Egyptian history. The question is always, does archaeology prove what the Bible says? Or does it match? Does it go along with what the Bible says? So in archaeology, do we find any mention of the plagues? Do we find any mention of Egypt losing most of their army about 1,500 to 2,000 years before Christ? Does that show up in the archaeological searches? The answer is no, not really. Why not? Because it's so old? Josh?
That's because the Egyptians like to erase history that wasn't favorable to them.
Sure. So they deleted it off of their thumb drives?
Well, in some cases, they would even take down statues of pharaohs and such like that.
Okay. How is their history, important history, how is that recorded? If you know, yes?
They record it as like they kicked the Israelites out.
Okay, but physically, how was it recorded? On a computer?
No.
Good.
Through
Hieroglyphics, is that what you're going to say?
Yeah.
Very good. See, you were right. Mostly. Hieroglyphics, yes, but important history, like national history, was recorded a little different than that. Anyone want to add to that?
Pictures.
Pictures of what? Pictures, what do you...
Like chronological pictures.
Okay.
I'll give you a fast idea.
You're on the right track. It was engraved in stone, is my point. So they draw pictures of kings and other kings that they had defeated, submitting to them, just like the Romans did and others. But the point is that they would engrave this stuff into stone, and there's many examples in archaeology of these monuments and steles, S-T-E-L-E, where the Egyptians had engraved on stone. Have you ever heard of the, of the black obelisk and the Rosetta Stone and so on? These are what I'm talking about. Engraved in stone, and there's many examples in archaeology of things that were unfavorable to the Egyptians where they just took chisels and a hammer and chopped off the engraving. They erased their own history that way. So if it wasn't favorable to the Egyptians. So that's probably a good reason why there's very little mention, if any, about the plagues or about this group of slaves leaving the land of Egypt. So, see, does that disprove the Bible? Absolutely not. Is there any other proof of anything that the children of Israel talk about, or that the book of Exodus talks about? Anything else? Mm-hmm.
I've heard that the children of Israel might have been used to build some of the pyramids. As far as there's bricks with straw in them, I've heard, or something like that. And normally bricks don't have
Bricks with straws.
Don't you make brick with straw?
because he.
Sorry?
Don't you make brick with straw?
Yes. Bricks with straw in them. Anybody know of anything about that? Yes, she's right. I have a picture of one in the Chicago Museum. It's a brick. It's a mud brick, and it's completely full of straw. You can easily see it. So who knows if an actual Israelite made it? I'm sure it was probably Jochebed that made it. You know what I mean? So we don't know if that was actually made, but it does prove that there were mud bricks. Well, the Bible actually says what they built. Some of what they built. The Bible says they built Ramses, which is a city named after the one main pharaoh, probably around the time of the Exodus. So there's some mutual mentions, in archaeology as well as biblical record of these things. So either way, I don't need those to find all of those things, but it is nice to be able to see a mud brick from Egypt. Of course, Egypt, it's kind of funny to me, kind of interesting that the Bible doesn't mention the pyramids. And most likely, I think, pretty sure they all say that the pyramids were there already. Well, they're pretty amazing. It's kind of odd that they wouldn't mention them. I don't know. Maybe they didn't live close by them. The pyramids of Giza are much to the south of where the land of Goshen is. So, anyway, so there's a couple thoughts about that. Let me mention to you, well, I'm just gonna give it to you, and I'm not gonna ask you to write it down because I don't want to take the time to labor through these. But there are some Egyptian pharaohs whose names we know. But Egyptian history, let me just warn you, is kind of jumbled up. They weren't real clear on their chronologies, I don't believe, because, well, the most obvious thing is, if you read Egyptian history, they all put some of the main pharaohs about 2400 BC. Anybody have a problem with that? What happened in about 2350 BC? The flood. So, anyway, their history, something's not right in their history because, and I'm not the only one to say this, I'm just repeating some, and I've for years thought that doesn't make any sense. But they do have a very, very ancient kingdom. Number of kingdoms and dynasties, old kingdoms, middle kingdom, late kingdom, and so on. I'm just warning you, Egyptian history to me is not very chronologically solid. There probably are quite a few problems in their dates. The way we would think of them, of course, to them, they had their system. So, Mose, they love the name Mose. Tutmos, Ahmos. Those are the main two, right? Well, when you think Thutmose or Ahmos. Moses, right? What does the name Moses mean? Drawn out of the water. What's the big deal about that? Why would you draw a kid out of the water and call him Moses? Well, I'm one of them. Edmund's middle name is Moses. But it's a family name for me, not because I drew him out of the water. I might have got him out of the lake down here. So, yes?
Because the princess found him in the water.
Okay, because she found him there. What is the big deal about the water, the Nile? Yes? I keep picking on him. Somebody else. Awesome.
They worship as a god.
They worship the Nile River, and so they would have seen Moses as some kind of a god they found him in the Nile River, and that means he's special, and so on. Drawn out of the water. He's a god. Pharaohs saw themselves as God, and certainly Moses was being trained to be a pharaoh. Probably. At least something along those lines. So there's Ahmos the first, 1600 BCE. Then Amenhotep the first. Thutmose the first. His daughter was Hatshepsut, the mother of Moses. She married Thutmose II, her half-brother, and Thutmose III would have been the rival to Moses, the one who Moses fled from out to the wilderness. When Moses returned, his son, Amenhotep II, was the Pharaoh, and that Amenhotep II, according to the timeline, is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Amenhotep II, and that's in your book. Thutmose III is when he fled, Amenhotep II is when he came back, and he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you 100% sure that that's who it was. It's believed that that's who it is, but again, I say Egyptian history might throw some wrinkles in that. So, just be careful of that. We do know that Amenhotep II became a ruler at 18 years old, and that would make him about 20, if he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus, like is believed, he would have been about 22 years old when Moses confronted him and said, "Let my people go." So it's pretty interesting that way. Okay, now let's get to the Bible, and, well, some of our understanding of the Bible is not conjecture, but some of our understanding of it, because we're so far removed from it, some of our understanding of it might be conjecture. But Exodus chapter 1. Let's talk about, from the book of Exodus, let's talk first of all, the slavery of Israel. Exodus chapter 1. And when I give you these notes, make sure you kind of keep these topics at least in order. So the slavery of Moses, and then make a side note underneath that, and continuing until I get to my next main point. The slavery of Israel, we find this in Exodus chapter 1, verse number 9. Here's the new king over Egypt. He said unto his people, "Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land." It's believed that this new Pharaoh, new king, was actually an outside group of invaders that had come into Palestine first and then worked their way down the coast, the Hyksos kings. They were an outsider group of kings who had taken over Egypt. By the time the Exodus takes place, I believe, the Hyksos kings were gone and had been ridded. Anyway, so what did they do with the children of Israel? Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they, that's the children of Israel, built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom, Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they, of course, were being grievously oppressed. They were made to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. So their slavery was that they served rigorously, the Bible says. They were being oppressed. And the children of Israel were suffering greatly. And of course, over a long period of time, this would have really started to wear them down. They know they're God's people. They know that they're supposed to live in freedom and victory. And that's not happening. And that takes place over several generations. Later on, some point in here, I forget where, but some point in here, we'll see how many generations actually take place with them in Egypt, which helps, of course, figure out some of our dating system. So they're in slavery. That then, not only are they made to serve, but then also we see a couple of things here as far as different stages in the oppression. Verse 15, they saw that it wasn't working with their rigorous slave work, so they said, hey, let's actually kill them if it's a son, verses 15 and 16. But verse 17 comes along, but the midwives feared God and did not, as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. Okay, so this was another stage of oppression. When the midwives didn't do their job of killing the baby boys, at some point, verse 21, because the midwives feared God, that he made them house, Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river. So, not only were midwives supposed to kill the baby right on the spot when they were being born, they were supposed to sometime in there take those babies and vividly, demonstrably throw them in the river. And that could, of course, happen even after they were born, for months after they were born. I'm assuming, any little child who had obviously been born during this time period of this law could be thrown into the river. And Moses is born into this situation of slavery. So we see the slavery of the children of Israel. Next, I want to talk about in chapter 2, the coming of Moses. Coming of Moses. Moses is a picture, I guess, of Christ. He's a savior of the children of Israel. And he had a miraculous birth. He had a miraculous death. He was rejected by his brethren. He was trained in the temple. You could say a number of things, but it's kind of a picture of Christ in some ways. But we see the coming of Moses in chapter 2, of course. He's born, and his mom isn't going to give him up that easy. And so she hides him. Well, how do you hide a screaming baby? She has to put him into an ark. That ark is a great picture, again, of salvation. The ark of Noah was a great picture of salvation. The ark of Moses, it's daubed with mortar and pitched with slime. I love the old English words there. But it's covered and it's sealed and it's protected from the water. And of course, she puts it into the bulrushes. That word, the bulrushes, there is interesting. It's the weeds in the sides of the river. What did the Egyptians use those weeds for, those bulrushes?
Didn't they write or paint or something along those lines?
Yes, you're online.
Papyrus.
Papyrus, paper. They would take those and soak them real good. And what you do is you put a whole bunch of, well, like that, right next to each other. And then you cross them with a whole bunch more, and it's all filled in, all the cracks. And you smash that completely flat. And while it's wet, and the mush inside the plant squeezes out, and it completely flattens out. And then you let that dry, and then you can write on it. So this is the paper, it's papyrus. And he was here in these bulrushes. It's pretty interesting. Of course, Miriam, his older sister. What did your book say about her? She was jealous, remember, at one point of Moses and his Ethiopian woman, his Ethiopian wife. But what was the scripture's final verdict on Miriam? Remember, that's the way your book put it? If you did your homework, you might remember that. Haha. Anybody? Was she a good woman, jealous woman?
Overall, she was good and on good intention.
Good intention. She was a good lady. The Bible describes her as a godly woman. So, even though she messed up, like I think I might have once or twice. So, I think it's happened. Probably wasn't my fault. It was probably somebody else's. So, but here in chapter 2, we find this coming of Moses. Next, in chapters 3 and 4, I want you to see the call of Moses. Okay, Moses, in the end of chapter 2, he's in the palace of the king. He grows up. According to Egyptian history, archaeology, we believe that, well, there's some things we know, but there's things else we believe. We believe that he was very well educated. Egypt was known for a number of things. They were known for education. They were known for music. And they were known for public speaking. And Moses was well versed in these things. They're known for many other things, but those things would have implication on what we're discussing here. So Moses was well educated. He was well trained. He would have had the best of education. He would have had some knowledge of military warfare taught to him. We see this showing up later when he leads the children of Israel out of Egypt and defeating the Amalekites and so on, him and Joshua both. He would have had training in all these things. He was a good Egyptian in that sense. But then he made a decision one day to go away from the Egyptians and to see his brethren. That decision was not a light decision. It was a well thought out, planned decision. Hebrews chapter 11 says that he chose to go out there. And he chose to reject his life in Egypt. And he chose to see and identify with the children of Israel. And the play that I watched this summer really shows that well, I think. Shows the decision that he made to follow after the Lord. But he made the wrong decision in how he went about it. And so he ends up having to flee and run out into the wilderness, as we say, the backside of the desert. and that's where he would live for 40 years. The call of Moses takes place while Moses is out in that wilderness, the wilderness of Sinai. Now, where did Moses go? Where is Mount Sinai? That's the big question. Where is Mount Sinai? Moses had gone out there to this wilderness. It's the land of Midian. It would become later known as the land of Midian. It was the land of these are his wife's people, the Midianites. Moses married a Midianite woman. If you look on a map, which I should have with me, but I don't have a good map of this, but you can probably see it in your Bible and your books. The land of Midian is further east than the Sinai Peninsula. And almost all regular maps that show the exodus from the land of Egypt show the Sinai Peninsula as the center of where Moses was at, where Mount Sinai was at, and where the children of Israel, when they would have the exodus, would cross the Red Sea and come down into that Sinai Peninsula. And more, I'm having a hard time accepting that as a proper route of travel. There's a number of pretty good theories out there that show an entirely different direction that they went. So in a little bit, I'm going to take a break, and I'll get the map that I do have, and I can at least show you some more of that. As far as show you some of this other main theory that puts the Mount Sinai in a totally different location than the typical location. And I'll explain to you some things about that. But God calls Moses here when Moses is at Mount Sinai. We know that from other passages in the book of Galatians, of all things. Paul says that he went to the Mount of God, to Mount Sinai, same place that Moses was at. But this burning bush experience, and Moses is called of God to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. Moses is excited about this, right? No. He does what we do. He does what we do. He makes excuses. He didn't want to go. Let me give you these 5 excuses. You should know these because you probably have tried these at some point. First, who am I? Who am I? Chapter 3, verse 11. Moses said unto God, who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh? You are going to be a Pharaoh at one time, Moses. You might be a good candidate for this. You know how the Egyptians think. You know how to talk to them. You know how to deal with royalty in Egypt. Who am I? You're the one that God has prepared to do this. Another question, verse 13. What shall I say? Behold, when I come to the children of Israel, shall say unto them, the God of your fathers has sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, what is his name? What shall I say unto them? So his second question is a second excuse. What shall I say? I don't know what to tell. And he's not saying, what shall I say to the Pharaoh? He's saying, what shall I say to the children of Israel? They're just blindly following their master's orders. They're not going to listen to me. What shall I say? Who sent me? And of course the answer is, I am that I am sent you. Third, another excuse in chapter 4, verse 1. They won't believe me. But behold, they will not believe me nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, the Lord hath not appeared unto thee. Isn't that silly? The children of Israel wanted out of Egypt so bad, out of slavery, but when somebody comes along to tell them it's time to get out of slavery, they say, no, you're making this up. You're not really sent of God. Well, Moses knew they were going to have that excuse. They won't believe me. So God said, what do you have in your hand? I love how God has an answer for our excuses. I can't do that. Oh, really? God didn't say, yes, you can. Do it anyway. He said, what do you have in your hand, Moses? A rod. Throw it on the ground. And it turns into a snake. And Moses, the big, strong man that he is, turns and runs away from the snake. And so God was showing Moses, it's the power of God that will accomplish this work, not you, Moses. Fourth, he's finally resorts to almost a flat-out lie. Chapter 4, verse 10, I am not eloquent. Now, I understand that he hadn't used his skill of speaking for years and years, but he certainly would have been eloquent when he was back in Egypt, speaking. The Bible, Hebrews chapter 11, never mind, I'm not going to go there. But I'm pretty sure that Hebrews 11 even says that he was able to talk to them. Anyway, we know that once they got down to Egypt, God sent Aaron to help Moses, and from then on, Moses does all the talking. So he was eloquent. This is just an excuse that he was trying to get out of it. And then the last thing, chapter 4, verse 13, he just said, Lord, I know it's a good idea that we deliver the children of Israel. Why don't you find somebody to do it? Send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. Send somebody else. Can somebody else go? That's the excuse there. He didn't want to go. And so God said, we already have that problem taken care of. It's your brother, and he's almost to meet you already. He's coming out to find you already. And so his brother showed up, and Moses then was willing to go. All right, Acts chapter 7 is a great passage on this time period of talking about Moses. Acts chapter 7 is the deacon Stephen preaching to the Jews, and he rehearses some of this history. And so it's actually a very important passage, and kind of sheds light on some things from Exodus chapter 3 and chapter 4 that we don't find in Exodus 3 and 4. We find in Acts chapter 7. So it's a great passage. You might want to note that down and reference that later. But Acts chapter 7 kind of shows that Moses, I think your book puts it this way, Moses spent 40 years learning to be somebody. And then he spent 40 years in the desert learning to be nobody. And then he spent 40 more years learning that God uses a somebody who thinks he's a nobody. And I like that. It's very good. So 3 stages of Moses' life, each of them 40 years. All right, now that brings us to chapter 5 and 6. So we've talked about the slavery of Israel. We've talked about the coming of Moses and the call of Moses. Now let's talk about the challenge of Moses. Moses goes down to Egypt, Exodus chapter 5 and chapter 6, and he has to meet with 2 groups of people. One group is, who? Help me out. Pharaoh. And who else? Who's the other group of people? The Israelites. So he has to convince Pharaoh to let them go, and he has to convince the Israelites that it's time for them to go. How do you do that? They're living there in Egypt. They've lived there for hundreds of years. Their families, they're settled in. I know they're slaves, but man, they're weird because they keep on admiring Egypt, right? Even when they leave Egypt, when they're there, they're like, oh no, you can't get us out of here. We're just stuck here. And then when they finally leave, they say, oh man, the leeks and the onions and the garlics when we were in Egypt. It was great. I mean, at least we got to eat all this food. So it's weird their relationship with the Egyptians, Maybe they want to go back and get more gold on their way out the next time. I don't know. Their jewelry and things. But so Moses goes and challenges these 2 groups of people. So let's point out a couple things. Obviously, we know the responses. What did the Pharaoh do? He refused, and that's putting it nicely. Moses said, the Lord God has said, Jehovah God has said, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? Who is Jehovah? Who's your God? We have many gods, and he's not one of them. I've never heard of him. Not only that, our gods give us water in the Nile, give us lots of food in the fields. Our gods give us sun in the sky. They give us all these things. And look what your God gives you, Moses. Servants. Yeah, that's real nice. Your God is really good. He's a servant God. Can you picture what the Pharaoh must have thought? I mean, this is ridiculous. You know, you're asking us for favors and your God is giving orders? And look at you, a bunch of servants. And so Moses, I'm sure, said, oh, you don't know who God is? You're about to find out. You're going to meet him. He's going to demonstrate his power to you. So the Pharaoh refused, obviously. If Moses comes in there, I love chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. Y'all have too much time on your hands. If you're thinking about going and holding a feast to your servant God, no, back to work, and you're going to have more work than you did before, but the same quota. And so now, the children of Israel are made to work harder than ever. So now Moses meets with the second group, which is the children of Israel, and says, hey, God has delivered us from Pharaoh and from Egypt. And they said, really? Why don't you go back and get out of here, you know? We're here working harder than we ever did because of you. And so Moses has to demonstrate to them. He doesn't use the stick and so on, but he points out some things to them that God is with them. All right, so God has to send Moses back in again. All right, Moses, time to go back to the Pharaoh and tell him how it is, and this time you're going to demonstrate some of my power. So Moses goes back into the king again, chapter 6. Verse 10, 11, go speak unto Pharaoh. Let's see here. Verse 29? No. The rest of it is some other things. Where does he go back in? I guess it's not until the next chapter, chapter 7. All right, so God renews the promise with Moses that he will deliver them. Anyway, so these two groups of people, that's the important thing. All right, next, the salvation of Israel. That's my next main point. Salvation of Israel. And I mean the deliverance. 10 plagues will come on on the Egyptians. 10 great plagues. Some of them are nuisances. Some of them are deadly. But they're still all plagues. They're all disasters that came on the Egyptians. Now, if you read some books, they'll explain these miracles away. Because how do you have 10 miracles? You know, because God surely isn't powerful enough to do that. You know, that there'd be actually 10 miracles. So it must have just been, you can explain them away. So here's how they kind of start out. The first thing was the Nile River turned to blood. So they say what happened was that there were these plants in the Nile River that had this red dye. And just at the right time that these plants released this red dye, and it just polluted the river, and all the water looked like blood. Then the frogs said, we got to get out of this river because we're going to die. And so they climbed up out of the river, and there was just frogs everywhere because they didn't have a home in the river anymore. And then after they died, there was a disease, the lice. So that must be some kind of a disease that came out, and everybody got sick. And you see, it just goes from there. It's ridiculous. No. These early ones were nuisances that were supposed to get Pharaoh's attention. And Moses tried to tell him, look, you're going to keep getting more if you don't let us go. And Pharaoh, of course, would not let them go. All right. Do I need to give you all 10 of these? You have them in your book. And make sure you Know at least 5 of them for a test. Here, I thought this was interesting. Just listen to this. The first 3 were from the rod of Aaron. The next 3, there's no rod mentioned. The next 3 is the rod of Moses, and the 10th one is from the Lord. No rod at all mentioned. The first 3 brought discomfort. The blood, water to blood, the lice, and what was the second one? The frogs. The second 3 brought, they were despicable things, distaste, if you will. The next 3 were disastrous. They brought death. And then, of course, the last one was a disgrace. It killed the oldest son, including the Pharaoh's oldest son. Here's something interesting. Anyway, this is weird, but Numbers 1, 4, and 7, every third one in that case, these 3 were announced in the morning. 2, 5, 8, and 10 were announced. 3, 6, and 9 were not announced. In other words, they were not predicted. They didn't say anything was going to happen. It just happened. A number of the others were announced specific times in the morning. This is going to happen, and it did, just the way it was said. Numbers 1 and 2 were related to water. 3 and 4 were related to the dirt. 5 and 6 were related to the air right around us. 7 and 8 were in the sky, and 9 and 10 were beyond, from heaven. Interesting ways to look at it. Each of the 10 plagues were an attack on an Egyptian deity. You want to have a bunch of names of the Egyptian gods? I don't either, because I can't pronounce them. Right? I have an ISIS. Yeah, there's a good one. You know, Islamic. No, I'm kidding. ISIS. Hecht is the frog god. Ra or Re is the sun god. The Nile River. See, that's the easy one. The water turned to blood. They attack on their Nile River god. Apis, the bull. All right, so there's a lot of those. But all 10 plagues were an attack in some way on their gods or their worship system. The lice, especially. Think of the lice. What's the big deal there? The priests, especially, were very focused on cleanliness and being clean. And now they're covered in lice, which is kind of the epitome of unclean. Which, I don't have to worry about that very much. So it's kind of nice. So, all right, water to blood, frogs, lice, swarms of flies. Flies are just, I saw a headline the other day that said, if a fly lands on your food, do not eat it. I'm like, what if I go on a picnic, What are you going to do, skip the hamburger? No. No, that's not happening. The murrain was the disease, like an airborne disease. The boils, ouch. Hail coming down. Locusts, eating. Locusts were a feared destroyer. I mean, they could literally wipe out your food source within a few days. Anyway, just a very feared destroyer of crops and things. Darkness, an attack on one of their main gods, and then the death of the firstborn was an attack on the Pharaoh, because that firstborn son was going to be the next Pharaoh, and he was powerless to stop the death angel. So, okay, while these 10 plagues are coming, several times the Pharaoh tried to compromise with Moses, right? Because Moses said, let us go for 3 days journey in the wilderness and worship our God. He didn't say we're going to keep going, but that was the intent. once we get out the 3 days journey, we're not coming back. By the way, what's a day's journey? What's a day's journey? Any educated guess on that?
Around 10 miles.
What do you base that on, do you?
It's just that's something I thought I would.
Okay. I've read Western history books and stuff, and when they traveled west in the old wagon trains and things with some cattle, and even when they were on cattle drives with the cowboys and so on, they figured that typically 20 miles was a day's journey. So I would venture, if we can compromise in the middle there somewhere, 15 to 20 miles was probably about a day's journey. So you're talking 50 to 60 miles away from Egypt proper out into the wilderness. That's pretty far, especially with kids. Has anybody ever walked 20 miles? 14 miles? We did something like this once to raise money, a walkathon or something like that, I think we called it. And you had to go home. So, but it takes, what are you walking? How many miles an hour? Anybody know? 2 to 3, I think about 3. So 20 miles is about 6 to 7 hours of walking. And by the way, you do get sore when you walk that far. You girls that walk around the lake, I feel sorry for you because that takes long. I'd much rather run and get it done with. So, anyway, so they're going out a little ways into the wilderness, and Pharaoh tried to make compromises with them to get them to leave, but hold on to some of their possessions, trying to keep their strings attached to Egypt, because he knew what they were going to do. Yes.
For the plagues, do you want us to know the plague and the God that it was?
No.
Okay.
No. I just need 5 plagues, at least, for the test. Okay, some of the compromises. Pharaoh at one point after, I don't remember which plague, sorry, I don't have that. At one point, Pharaoh said, why don't you just stay here in the land of Egypt and worship here? By the way, Egypt is a picture of the unsaved world. In order to be saved, you have to come out from among them. So, in order to be saved, they had to leave. The picture of salvation is the the crossing of the Red Sea. Specifically, that event is a picture of salvation. Crossing, by the way, literally, on one side of the Red Sea was Egypt. On the other side of the Red Sea was Midian. They're leaving Egypt. That is the act of salvation, the picture of salvation. Coming into the land of Canaan, going to the wilderness is a picture of the struggle of the Christian life. And then coming to the land of Canaan is a picture of the victorious Christian life. Crossing the land of Canaan is not a picture of going to heaven. That's certainly not true. We used to sing, it's kind of funny now to think of, when people were baptized, we used to sing, "Shall we gather at the river?" That song is about death. You're supposed to sing that at a funeral. Anyway, I think I guess, you're dying to self and being baptized. Okay, I understand. But I don't think that was the intent of it. I need to give my 4 compromises and stop getting sidetracked. Stay in the land. Number 2, don't go far. Chapter 8, verse 28. Don't go far. Why not? If you're going to leave the world, go far. Leave. Leave so you're not coming back. Get away from the world. Stop playing footsie with the world. Have you ever heard that? If you're going to hang around Egypt, well, might as well move in. If you're going to hang around Sodom and Gomorrah, you might as well move in. If you're not going to hang around Sodom and Gomorrah, then move up onto the plateau far away so you're not tempted. You don't see it. You don't see it. You're far away. Same here with Egypt. Don't go far away. No, we're not doing that. Third, Pharaoh said, leave your families behind. Leave your families behind. Leave your wife and kids, just the parents, just the men, I'm sorry. No. Men can't worship God by themselves. They need their families. And then fourth, he tried to get them to leave their animals and possessions. You can go, but just have your possessions stay in the world. No, that's not going to work either. And so Moses refused to compromise with Pharaoh. Good thing. By the way, let me bring up here just real quick. There are numerous instances in this passage, Exodus chapter 5 through 8 or so, where during these plagues, where God said that Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses. And then as you get towards the later plagues, the Bible says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. It does not say anymore that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So you go to the book of Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9 says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. But don't forget that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart after Pharaoh repeatedly hardened his own heart. It was Pharaoh's fault that his heart was hard. And the more he hardened it, eventually God began to harden it. And at that point, make the argument that Pharaoh was a reprobate. He had been reprobated. He had been turned over to Satan. He was not going to get saved. But he hardened his own heart first, several times. Okay, I'm still underneath the salvation of Israel here. Another thought, the Passover. We can't skip over the Passover. This is underneath the salvation of Israel still. The Passover. What a great picture. Children of Israel, in order to keep their oldest son alive when the angel of death came through, it's interesting there, that word, that term, the angel of death. You know, we think of a guardian angel, that's good angels. What is an angel of death? Was the angel of death a good angel killing? It's possible. There's other times in the Old Testament where angels killed. Right? Hezekiah's day, the Assyrians. Any thoughts on that? My opinion is that that angel of death there is an evil angel that has been turned loose. It's an angel that's been turned loose. When God takes away his protection, evil angels kill. It's an angel of death. Anytime you read about death, it's Satan, it's the devil, it's, the angel, how does it put it, the angel of death on the white horse in the book of Revelation. So, the angel of death, it's an evil angel turned loose and allowed to do what it naturally does, kill. And so, of course, the only way to avoid it, to get that angel of death to pass over their house and go to the next, was to have the blood on the doors and sides of the door and on the top of the door. Yes?
I was looking at verse 23, when it says for the Lord will pass through this my predictions, and my pieces will
Oh, yeah. Which chapter is that?
Chapter 12, verse 23.
Chapter 12? There you go. Blow my theory out the water, right? Yes?
Yeah, I was about to question about because I had heard that it wasn't actually an angel. Heard high school teachers say
That it was the Lord. All right. Well, let me study it some more. My theory just blew it out of the water. Appreciate that. Publicly. All right. Let's skip that and keep on going. Some things about this lamb that had to be sacrificed. Okay, what kind of a lamb was it? Bible says it was a pure lamb. It was a pure lamb. A lamb without blemish. It also was a lamb in its prime. A young lamb. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. As if young is prime and older is not prime. So, and what did they say? 45 is the age 45 is like the equal balance of wisdom and strength. And from that point on, your wisdom continues to go up, but your strength starts to go noticeably down. I'll have you know I'm not 45 yet. Soon. But a prime lamb, a young lamb. Also, it had to be a personal lamb. It had to be their own lamb. Had to be personal. They had to bring their own lamb. And then fourth, it was a proven lamb. It wasn't the lamb that was going to die soon anyway, so might as well kill this little thing. It was of age. And they were supposed to sacrifice it. Now, how do you sacrifice it? If you can just imagine, literally, taking a lamb, laying it down on a table or something, cutting wide open its throat with a knife, and having a bowl there to drain the blood out of the throat into that bowl. It's called, what is it called in the passage? Well, not that that's important. The basin. It's called a basin. And then they would take lintel, not lintel, that's the doorpost. They would take hyssop, which is a branch of some kind with some leaves on it, and dip it into that. There's different ideas of what the hyssop actually looked like. Kind of a thorny bush, some call it. A branch with leaves on it. And they would dip that in the blood and splash it. Basically, you're splashing it up onto the sides. There was blood all the way down the side. There was, and especially on top, and then it would drip down to the bottom as well. So it clearly created the same effect as a cross. It's amazing to me that this picture on the doorpost. Why the doorpost? It has to be that is a picture of the cross. And so this is pre-planned by the Lord. Oh, there's so many little things we could talk about. All right, so that concludes my section on the children of Israel in Egypt, and it's time for the exodus from the land of Egypt. Let me quickly touch on this, and then I'll give you a couple-minute break. In chapter 14, the Bible says that it's time now. Pharaoh has let them go, and notice the timing. Am I in chapter 14? Sorry. I'm missing it somewhere. It's right in here. All right, why don't we take a quick break, and I'll let you get a drink or something, and then we'll come back together. Okay, let's get started. This is as big a map as I have of it. There is a map somewhere around here, one of these wall maps, probably a couple classrooms over. But this is a picture here of land of Goshen and the delta. Looks like a pitchfork with the Nile River. And then of the typical route that they took when they left Egypt, and I've seen this in my Bible ever since I was a little kid in the back, that they came just away from Egypt, what's known as Egypt here, and came down here, and that this used to be an arm of the Red Sea coming all the way up into here, and that this is where they ran into the Red Sea and crossed. Then they came into the Sinai Peninsula and down to Mount Sinai, and then eventually worked their way back up here to Kadesh Barnea. So that's the standard route of the Exodus. That's what this map calls the route of the Exodus. That's pretty normal. You'll see that. About 30 years ago, there's a guy who is now passed away, but he didn't believe this, and he discovered, explored all kinds of things down into this area over here, Midian. And anyway, he had a lot of other kind of loony ideas, but I tend to believe that he was right on here. My opinion is that this is wrong. Let me give you a couple reasons, just real quick. Who identified these sites on here? Who identified this Jebel Musa, the mountain there, as Mount Sinai? Who identified that? Peter?
Constantine's mother.
Constantine's mother, Helena. Anybody know anything about Helena?
Wasn't she a little whacked in the head?
A lot whacked in the head, as you put it. She was way off in a lot of things. She also found, 300 years after, she found a part, like a small piece of the cross of Jesus Christ. It was a little piece of wood. She found that. I can't believe you're doubting. So she identified all kinds of sites. Now note, she's from Rome. Okay, she traveled down here. She identified a lot of sites. I'm sure she was right on a lot of the sites. I'm sure she was right. What did she do? History says she asked the locals who lived there, what is that? And everybody said, oh, that's the Temple Mount. What is this thing? That's Bethlehem. This is where, for 1,000 years, they've said that this is where Jesus was born. Not 1,000 years in her place. What am I thinking of? Where David's home was, Bethlehem. For hundreds of years, they've said this is where Jesus was born. So a lot of the sites she's probably right on, as long as she listened to the people who lived there. But Mount Sinai isn't like that. Anyway, let me just throw... I don't... The part of the main reason for believing this is it's thought that 3 days after they left Egypt, they were at the Red Sea. That is not the case at all. If you study the passages, read the number of months, the time that goes by when they get to the Red Sea, I believe is over a month later. There's several reasons for that. Egyptians, how long do they mourn their dead? Anybody know? It's 40 days. That's over a month. There's a lot of things like that. What is Egypt? Is Egypt right here over? Or is Egypt the Sinai Peninsula? Well, to this day, Egypt is the Sinai Peninsula is a part of Egypt. In fact, it doesn't say it here, but there's a little river that comes over here. It's called the River of Egypt. Cross that border and you're into the land of Canaan. So this is, sorry if you can't see over here, but this Sinai Peninsula here is definitely a part of the, wow, on this map, you can hardly even see the Sinai Peninsula. That's how small it is. It's that little tip there. Just comes down. Tiny, tiny little area. Okay, so you say, well, what is the other route? Okay, I'll show you what the other route is. The other route says that they left Goshen, came all the way across to this side of the Red Sea. And somewhere right in here, they crossed over. There's some really good reasons to believe that. Number one, well, a lot of reasons. One is that this is Midian over here. Later on, the Bible describes, in Galatians, it describes Mount Sinai as in the land of Midian. Another reason is that Moses' family came to meet them when they were traveling along with the people. What did Moses' family do? They met him at Sinai. Where were they from? Midian. They didn't travel all the way down here, hundreds of miles. They came over to Moses. What was Moses? He was at Mount Sinai when he had the flocks. There's another very, very interesting thing. In this wing of the Red Sea, it's very deep. Except at this spot where they would have crossed. Anyway, study it out. There's about 10 more good reasons why this other theory might be more dependable than Helena, her theory. So, okay, so that's some things about the Exodus. Look in chapter 12, verse 41. Actually, go to verse 40. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. Verse 41. Came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass. Do you notice that the children of Israel put a lot of stock in genealogy, in times, in family? You know, they know their family lines. They know their timelines. They put a lot of emphasis on that. And here they are as slaves in the land of Egypt, and they still kept really meticulous charts of their time in Egypt. On the same day, Moses said this. Moses, do you think he's a little busy right about now? Right? I know he was inspired of God, but Moses wrote this. And he said it was the same day 430 years later. Well, you know, there's a few dates like that that are very important. Just a couple months ago, right? A month ago was 500 years since Martin Luther, right? Some of you thought that was because it was Halloween. So, but you understand, that's kind of what we would do. We'd say that's a pretty important date. Well, it was very important to them. 430 years later. Okay. Now let's, I'm going to call this, so my first section really was the children of Israel in Egypt. Now let's talk about the children of Israel in the wilderness, and that'll take us through the rest of the semester, which is 3 more weeks. Children of Israel in the wilderness, and that'll take us through the law, the giving of the law, Mount Sinai. It'll take us through some of the major events as they're traveling along and how they traveled and so on. All right, so the children of Israel in the wilderness, there's several sections of this that we need to divide. Let's first of all talk about their trip to Sinai, their journey to Mount Sinai. They traveled down to Sinai. And the first step in that, of course, is this little event known as the crossing of the Red Sea. Chapter 14. Again, don't have time to dig into all the details. Wonderful, great story amazing story of God's power. The wind blowing on the water so strong it divides the waters wide enough for 2 million people to pass through. And not only that, but the ground beneath was dry. Amazing. It's so amazing that it's looked back on all throughout the Old Testament as this great event, which it was. The miraculous event, that miracle that God did for them. 2 million. I threw that number out. Where do we get that number from? What? How many people? If you read certain liberal Bible critic books about the crossing of the Red Sea, I mean, they act like there was about 1,000 people crossing here. That's just ridiculous. That's impossible. We're talking a lot of people here. Anybody know where the term about 2 million comes from?
Would they calculate just with the people that came with Jacob?
Not really. It's not a calculation. It's not just a guess. Well, it is kind of a guess, but not based on that. Numbers the book of Numbers. Hello, Numbers, right? Numbers chapter 1 says that there were, and I'm going to throw out an approximate number. That there were about 600, it's like 603,000, and let's the exact number. About 600,000 adult males in the army. So, if there's 600,000 adult males, that means what? there's about 600,000 adult females, if most of these are married. But even if they're not, it's pretty standard that there's about the same number of men and women. What is in America? I think there's more women than men. I know here at Fairhaven there's usually more women than men in the college, but I don't know if that means anything. I'm trying to think if that's any spiritual implication. I'm kidding. So it probably means there are about 600,000 women. If these are married couples and each of them had one child, that's another 600,000. So we're already at 1.8 million. And I think that there were way more than that, because people back then didn't have one child. They weren't in China, you know. They had large families. That's just, everybody had large families. Now you say, well, not all of them were married. But you can easily make an obvious guess that there were at least 2 million people, or right around that. Okay, that's where that number comes from. The crossing of the Red Sea, God's great miracle there. Next, let's talk about, the waters of Mara. The waters of Mara. They come to the waters of Mara after they leave the Red Sea. They're out of water already. I think these people are out on a huge life-changing trip, and they don't have the natural supplies you need. Of course not, because God was going to take care of them. God was going to show them his power in taking care of their needs. And so they don't have food, and they don't have water. You say, well, they had animals. They could have killed their animals. Right, yeah. And they could have gone to the land of Canaan with no animals. You know, by the time they get there, they're all eaten up. So what did God do? He led them along, providing for their needs. Where was I? Oh, the waters of Mara is the first place they come to after they cross the Red Sea. And they need water. There's no water. And so they're complaining. And believe it or not, this is the first time that they name off. Actually, sorry, it's not the first time. Unbelievable. When they're at the Red Sea, blocked in, they said, we wish we would have just died in Egypt rather than coming out here. Then they said that again at the waters of Mara, the bitter waters. Remember Mara? Naomi said, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. But this water was bitter, and Moses did what he was supposed to do. And this is, you'll see a repeating pattern here. Children of Israel complain, say they want to go back to Egypt, and Moses takes their complaints to the Lord, and the Lord says, hey, don't you do this? Oh, okay. And everything gets taken care of. Instead of them going to the Lord directly like they should have, Moses always has to go for them. And he, of course, cuts down a tree and throws it in the water, and the waters of Mara are healed. There's an important lesson for them. There's also the manna from heaven that's given. The manna from heaven that's given to them in the wilderness there. God providing their food supply. The Bible says in chapter 16 that this manna was given to them, and it says that there was enough on the ground, this manna for them to eat, enough for every person to have an omer. Now, what is an omer? It's believed that that's about, what's a pint? 2 pints is a quart. That's about 6 pints per person. Now, that's not a gallon, is it? Right? 6 pints. I'm forgetting my numbers here. I haven't thought about those in a while. 3 quarts. Thank you. So that's about 3 quarts of food per person per day. So in our family, we would need 36 quarts. What is that? 9 gallons of food a day. That's a lot of food. And it's out on the ground. Well, what was it? What is it? Manna. That's the Hebrew word. What is it? They all asked that question. What is it? They didn't know what it was. Now, what was it? You want to answer the question? This is my trick question, actually. I'll let you in. Don't even try to explain this away. Yes?
I always joked and said it was baklava.
Baklava? What is that?
It's a Jewish dessert. It's literally.
Oh, yeah. I knew I'd heard of that
with
before.
honey.
Yeah. Sounds like Shema to me. Any Afrikaners in here? Anyway, what is it? Bible says it's food from heaven. John chapter 6, Jesus talked about it. It's manna from heaven. It's heavenly food. It's the angels' food. You say, well, what is it? I can't tell you what it is because we don't know what it is. They didn't know what it was. So they just nicknamed it, what is it? Manna means what is it? We don't know what it was. It was food from heaven. And the dumb Bible critics, I said that for the camera, the dumb Bible critics say that it was these bushes, these tamarisk bushes that drop their seeds every day. Okay, if you have 50 people out on the desert, I can kind of understand that. But when you have 2 million people out in the desert, don't tell me there were that many tamarisk bushes. It's impossible. So, how much food was dropped? If there were about 2 million people in the wilderness, they have estimated out that that's about 20 freight cars of food every day. 4,500 tons of food every day dumped out on the ground. Don't tell me it was tamarisk bushes. It's impossible. So the manna from heaven. By the way, this manna, Jesus talked about it. It was real. It was actually food from heaven. John chapter 6, Jesus, the Pharisees came and said, our fathers ate manna from heaven. What do you got? Can beat that? And Jesus said, I am the bread of life that came from heaven. Told them off. He said, I am the bread of life. I am the food from heaven. They ate me. They believed on me. Of course, he turned it spiritually, but still, it's a perfect picture of Christ. That manna from heaven. Picture of Christ. You had to have it every day. You had to have it every day. It was small. Jesus Christ was humble. It was pure white. The Bible describes it as a small white thing. Purity. It was round. Picture of the eternal nature of Jesus. It was sweet. The sweet balm of Gilead, Jesus Christ. On and on. It was satisfying. It was everything they needed. It had all the vitamins. What do they say? The 9 necessary nutrients, and the stupid cereal boxes. What do they call that? The nutrients, right? Your necessary nutrients, or I'm missing the right term for it. Essential vitamins and nutrients, or something like that. It had everything they needed was in this little food. They could make different things out of it. They could mix it and make cakes, or bread. When I call it cake, like a bread, they could eat it plain. They could make a doughy mixture out of it, cook it, or bake it. They had lots of different things they could do with it. It was all satisfying. Picture of Jesus Christ. So God was leading them through the wilderness. All right, we got to stop. We'll pick up there next time we have class, which is next Tuesday.